Well, thank you all for joining today. I know it's a late Thursday afternoon, so much appreciated for taking some time. We are the latest Google developer group, plus a community of other meetups who are working on giving a What's New in Android 11 talk. This is specifically going to be a three-part series. The first one obviously is today. The next one will be in about 2 weeks. We'll post it as soon as we have a speaker. We've got some really interesting speakers in the pipeline. We haven't quite narrowed it down to who it is, but it'll be either July 23rd or 24th. More to come there. And then we actually have our speaker nailed down for the first week of August. That'll be a bit of a surprise, but she's awesome and she's given talks at our meetups before. So I'll be very excited to hear from her. We wanted to give a couple of announcements first. We've actually got a bit of a bit of a surprise announcement. Before we go on though, real quick, the next Android 11 talk on the 23rd or 24th, I'm working with Google right now to get some swag that we're going to give away. So I can't promise we're going to have it, but I'm pretty sure we're going to have it. So I highly recommend you all come and we'll get you some cool swag. So neat. Jimmy, do you want to go to the next slide? Cool. So this is kind of the grand announcement of devcommunity.org. A little background on this Google developer group and several of the other groups, and I'll go through that in a minute. We've been running quite a few different meetup groups, and I've got a list of them a little bit later. And we've decided to kind of pull it all together into kind of one effort and centralize the place where we can actually go and look up the content from any of these meetup groups. Specifically, it'll be, as it says there on the slide, that it's a central repository of all of our meetups. We record all of our meetups. We post them all on YouTube and other events like DevFest DC, Android Summit, DC Startup Week, just to name a couple. iOS Dev Camp's another one. So we are kind of based in the DC area, but that is not limiting. We want to open it up really to the rest of the world, and that is a big goal of devcommunity.org. So I will talk a little bit about that in a second. Jimmy, can you go to the next slide? All right. I can't see the text. Maybe try, go, there it is. Oh, nice little animation. Cool. So we'll make these slides available to everybody afterwards. But devcommunity.org is pretty self-explanatory. On the right-hand side, you'll see a screenshot of our current homepage. You'll see there's an automatic upcoming meetups is listed on the right-hand side. Some of our branding at the bottom for some of the meetups that you'll see on the left that we support. Currently, we have 8 meetups. We have the GDG group, we have the DC Android group, DC iOS, Cloud DC, a Kotlin group, a Flutter group, Android Plus, DC Droids, and Google Cloud DC. If you go and look at that devcommunity.org, we are going to have a newsletter sign up. It's already live. If you want to volunteer to speak, over there you can see the button to volunteer to speak. Like I said, we have a YouTube channel, and we are part of many interesting conferences down at the bottom: DevFest DC, Android Summit, iOS Dev Camp, and DC Startup Week. So I highly recommend everybody take some time and go take a look at that page. Couple of items. One is please be kind. It's very new. We just put it out there. It's also built with a really interesting technology called Flutter Web. If you're a Flutter developer, that is very new. And so we are experimenting with Flutter. Thank you, Jared Alexander. He's one of our organizers, and he took it on himself to build the page. So we're going to continually improve it. The last piece is that we actually don't have a logo yet. We have some designers looking at some really interesting logos. More to come there too. All right, neat. Next slide. Cool. So I'm gonna turn this over to Jimmy and Naveed in just a second, but I wanted to give kind of an update. Jimmy and Naveed has co-founded a startup with Louis De La Rosa and maybe some other folks, and have been operating for a good long time. It's basically presenting a lot of the same content, or at least has the same mission as DC Android. So we're really just going to combine Android Plus with DC Android. I currently work at Capital One, and I will tell you that a lot of our organizers work at Capital One, but the first meetup that I ever went to at Capital One was the Android Plus group. And actually, I think Jimmy and Naveed were presenting. I know Naveed was talking about Parse, if anyone remembers Parse. So Jimmy, Naveed, you guys want to chime in here?
Yeah, so we were thinking that we had a lot of Android meetup groups that all had the same ideas, the same goals of bringing together a community and just speaking with each other, knowing, learning about Android together. And it was starting to get a little bit confusing when people were asking, hey, is this the DC Android group? No, actually, we're this other group. And ultimately, it's the same people and the same community. And we just wanted to make it a little bit simpler by combining our efforts. And just a little bit of history about it. We, like Jared was saying, originally Louis found this in 2014. So it's been going on about 6 years plus. And we've talked about a lot of technologies like Flutter, Parse, MLKit. We did a couple of VR things. And originally it was called Android plus Glass. But we removed the Glass part because that wasn't really supported by Google a lot anymore. So it became just Google Plus because we wanted to mean plus anything. But now that we're joining forces, we're still going to be continuing. We're still going to be bringing you guys meetups. It's just going to be under a slightly different branding, and you guys can still expect the same amount of funness and learning and community as you had before. Yep, that's all I got.
All right. Hey, funness is like the most important thing there is, right? Naveed, anything you want to add, or you?
No, basically content with what Jimmy had. They actually started the meetup before I joined, but like as soon as I joined, I just jumped into it. I know we started off with a really, really small community. And as the number of events and the number of people grew, it only made sense that we had a lot of overlap. So to the original point, now we're merging the two so people don't have to come to one meetup on Tuesday and then the same people are coming to another meetup on Thursday with very similar content.
Yep. Awesome. I'll tell you, Glass is very near to my heart. I was actually at Google I/O when they jumped out of the blimp and scroll shooted down with the first version of Glass onto the top of the Moscone Center. It was amazing. So I went and spent a bunch more money than my wife approved of. But you know what? For once, I did it, and she didn't. So I think that's fine. Cool. All right, one more slide. Let's move on to the next one. All right. So I want to give a big conference announcement. So obviously with the pandemic, a lot of conferences are not being hosted this year. Android Summit, iOS Dev Camp, we have a lot of really interested individuals, and we weren't really sure what we were going to do with it. So the leaders of iOS Dev Camp and Android Summit sent out a survey. We are part of that community, and more or less asked the community if they wanted us to host these events virtually. And the overwhelming response was yes. About 96% of respondents said yes. And that is a huge amount of support. So we are just inspired by that. And we are going to officially host Android Summit and iOS Dev Camp DC. We have a meeting either tomorrow or Monday to kick that off. But I want to let this community know that there will be a virtual Android Summit and iOS Dev Camp. They will be fully virtual. Those two are likely to be in October. DC Startup Week is actually run by some of our GDG partners. I am somewhat active with DC Startup Week, and that will also be very virtual, completely virtual as well. I highly recommend Startup Week if you're at a startup or thinking of going to a startup. More to come, more information to come there, but I believe DC Startup Week will likely be September. Call for papers will be coming soon, so if you're interested and want to give a talk, we'd love to have you. So thank you very much. I think that's all my slides. So Naveed and Jimmy, take it away.
All right, so now for the main event. We're gonna talk about what's new in Android. My name is Naveed Khan. I think we briefly give an intro. I work here at Capital One. I'm one of the software engineers that work on the primary mobile app that's in the Play Store. Jimmy, you wanna give a little intro?
My name is Jimmy. I am also a mobile engineer alongside Naveed.
All right. So next slide, we can start. So today we're going to talk about what's new in Android 11. We're going to talk about the actual framework and some of the tools and libraries that were updated as part of Android 11 release. So let's start. To start off, we're going to cover the UI because that's what the users see, and a lot of customers care about that. And we'll eventually dive into the development stuff. So first, it is the window Insets API that receives some major updates. So for the past, Android has been making slight improvements on where to place your content, but it never gave you a lot of information on like where the status bar is, where the navigation bar is, and how the keyboard comes up. So they added a lot of new functionality and deprecated some of the old ones that wasn't as relevant as part of the 11 release. Next slide. So in order to give you an example of how you would use that, so one of the major issues if you have been an Android developer was to figure out, hey, is this keyboard visible? And I personally have ran into this issue a lot of times, whether the keyboard was visible or not, so I can adjust my content properly. Well, with this release, you can do stuff like this, where you can apply an inset listener onto your view, and it will give you information about not just the keyboard, but other window related items as well. So for this example, I'll just go through it quickly. If you call insets.isVisible and pass in the IME type, which is your input method editor, it'll tell you simply whether the keyboard is visible or not. Previously, there was a lot of hacky ways of doing it, including setting a global layout listener, and then seeing if your view was changing, or even calling some private API, which was definitely not a recommended way of doing it. Furthermore, you can actually, instead of just finding out whether it's visible or not, you can get more information about the insets of the keyboard itself as well, so you can react to it. Next slide. So what's the point of all of this? Well, now you can react to how the keyboard renders and how it appears and shift your content to improve the user experience as it comes up. So next slide. So we'll go to an example. So over here, you'll see on the left is the system-driven UI. So as you click onto the edit text view, the keyboard comes up. Now this is driven by the system. So the system is determining how fast the keyboard is coming up, but you still have the ability to do something about it. So you can attach some kind of a listener to it and react to it as it comes up. On the right, as a developer, you're driving how the keyboard is coming up. So not only can you listen for changes, you can also attach your UI with the system rendered events. For example, how the keyboard on the right is coming up. So we're going to go through each one on how to implement this. So next slide. So over here, this is the system one. So as the content comes up, you can attach a callback listener to it. So this will not let you control the keyboard per se, but if you want to react to how the keyboard is coming up, then you can listen to any of these events and react accordingly. So in this quick example, we're just sliding all of the messages up, and that's based on just attaching a simple listener and then reacting to it. So next slide. We can actually control how the keyboard comes up. So you do that instead of attaching a listener, you're defining a controller and you pass in a bunch of parameters. For example, starting with the type, since this is the keyboard example, we're using the input method editor type. The duration is infinite because it's not really a specific time that we want the keyboard to come up. It's basically based on how the user drags it up. And then you can control the acceleration and all of the fancy physics as it comes up. So it makes your UI very nice and consistent. Next slide. To find out more about this, and if you really want to dig into this, you can visit this link to have a working sample of both the system and the user-driven keyboard example. Next up is conversations. So you may have noticed, like on the notification bar, Google has been making a lot of changes on how notifications are organized. And with the release of 11, there has been more updates where you'll notice a lot of your standard notifications will be on the bottom, and typically conversations would include the stuff that you really care about or the people you care about. So what they've added in this release is to bundle all of this together, but also give developer an option to further improve the experience for the user. So in this one, if you notice the top part, which has the conversation group, you can actually select a conversation that you care about and change the priority of it. So, and then what that will do is it will move that conversation to the top. So I mean, a use case could be you're in a very chatty group and that group message is always on the top, but you don't really care about that one. There are other messages that you do care about. Previously, they were all prioritized the same, but now as a user, you have the ability to prioritize certain stuff within the conversation block. So as a developer, how do you implement that? So it's built on top of the notification API. So you'll notice similar builder patterns. You start off by defining a person, and give it some information about how the notification or how the conversation should be created. It needs to be long-lived because if the underlying application dies, it still needs to be visible and continue to receive updates. Then you'll use their shortcut manager to post that, to push that. And then you'll notice if you have been an Android developer, this should look familiar and you've dealt with notification. It's just using the standard notification API. So if you hit next, so you're essentially creating the notification, but adding the additional set shortcut ID, which you created above, adds some metadata to the existing notification API. All right, next up is bubbles. So what are bubbles? If as an Android user, you may be familiar with what Facebook implemented at one point, what was called chat heads. It was essentially a small UI that was rendered no matter where you were on the screen. Now, as part of Android 11, this has become native. So instead of deep linking, think of it as like a super enhanced notification. Instead of deep linking from into your application from a notification, now you can create a UI that is available right there, and it can perform a small action that the user is really interested in instead of having to navigate into the main application. So you go to the next slide. So if you currently have Android 10, these bubbles are actually already available, but you have to go into developer options to turn them on. In Android 11, they are available by default. So you don't have to do any special developer option stuff to turn them on. Previously, system alert windows were used to accomplish similar stuff. But as part of the 11 release, it is recommended that if you are using the system alert window, that you replace it with the new Bubbles API. As far as creating them, it's also, again, it's built on top of the notification API. So you'll see as we go into the example that it uses pretty standard construction data. So each bubble, what you saw in the previous screen, is technically an activity. And that activity is what's going to define your UI, but think of it as kind of a mini activity. So to start off in the manifest, you'll set the resizable activity to true. Next slide. And then this should look familiar if you are an Android developer. You're essentially creating an intent, attaching it to a pending intent. And then the only new part you'll notice would be this bubble metadata that you would have to create. So this bubble metadata, you're going to specify the shortcut that you've created previously. And then all you're doing is attaching it to the notification API on the bottom where it says set bubble metadata. And it will render just like it showed on that previous screen, depending on how you define your UI. So if you want to find out more about bubbles, you can go to this GitHub page to see an example, a working example. There's also a podcast episode for Android developers backstage, episode 140, which talks about bubbles as well. Next up is the privacy improvements. So Android has been making a lot of changes to privacy and improvements as part of the recent releases. And with the release of Android 11, it is only getting better. And if you're a developer, it is getting more strict. So one of the items is data access auditing. So if you're a small developer or if you're a solo developer, then this may not matter as much to you because you're aware of what your application is accessing and why it's accessing it. But even in that case, if you include third-party libraries, or especially if you're working on a very enormous enterprise-level app and you're a new developer, you may not be aware of why certain things are being accessed. So for example, like, why is the splash screen asking for a location? And as a new developer, you may not be aware. So with the release of 11, they've simplified this process of exploring why certain things are being accessed. So this dives into the developer realm. So if you go to the next slide. So you can essentially implement a callback that will give you information about when the data is accessed. And then as a developer, you can figure out if the access is appropriate or not. And this is a system level service that you would attach the callback to. So go to the next slide so we can see that example. So over here, you're essentially just defining your callback interface, and you override these three methods that you would use to notify. And this is pretty standard. Like if you are doing Android, if you're an Android developer, you're accessing it like just as you would any system service, and then you attach your listener to it. And every time something of interest is accessed, it will notify you with some metadata, so you can, as a developer, you can go and debug. All right. Next up is one-time permissions. So if you've noticed in the recent releases, Google has been making a lot of changes to how permissions are accessed. We've kind of migrated away from defining everything into the manifest to runtime permissions, and now making further improvements to that. So previously, this dialog would only have two things, which was while using this app, if you have Android 10, or you can grant it permission permanently, or you can deny it. Now they've added this other option, which is only this time. So as a user, if I want to grant location for whatever reason, like say I'm using a coupon app, but I only want to grant this permission, this specific instant, because I want to access some coupon or something. And so I want to give it location permission. Then that permission is only granted at that specific moment. And as soon as the user closes the app, that permission is now gone. So the next time the user launches the app, that permission will still be there. So what does it mean as a developer? As a developer, if you're following best practices for permission already, then this is not any different from setting it to while using the app. Because if you've already implemented or handled that use case, then this use case for only this time would be handled by default. All right, go to the next slide. Next up is further restrictions on background location. So previously, you could request foreground and background location kind of was bundled together, and you can request user that one location permission, and you'll be granted both. Now you would have to request the foreground permission first, and then ask for background permission. And because of additional privacy concerns against background permission, it will actually take the user to the setting so they have more context that this is a system level permission that they're granting for your application. There are also changes to the foreground services. Previously, in the manifest, you had to specify when you wanted to use location. Now, in addition to location, now you have to, if you want to use the camera and microphone, you would have to specify these as well. So we can see an example on the next slide. So if you, it's pretty familiar syntax, similar to how you were doing it for the location. You would just specify the camera and microphone as a foreground type, service type in your manifest to access them. And there's more. So package visibility. There are restrictions now to the packages. Previously, the apps could query everything that was, potentially everything that was available on the device. Now that's no longer the case. You need to specify in the manifest what you're interested in, and then you can only query that stuff. There are changes to the scope storage. Like you can do access to raw path names and batch editing with media store APIs. There are also auto reset permissions. So for example, you installed an application like a year or two ago, and now you for some reason gave it access to your location or maybe to the certain storage permissions, and you haven't used that app for like a year or two. That permission would auto reset. It does not really specify what the time period is when that permission is reset, and I haven't done enough digging to figure out. But as a developer, you should be aware of that it could reset at any time. So as long as you follow best practices for permissions, this should not be a problem. All right, so now we're gonna jump more into the developer side of things that came with Android 11. First up is Wi-Fi debugging. One of the main issues that at least I run into all the time, especially with the new MacBooks, is there aren't enough USB ports. So obviously using a hub is a solution, but doing Wi-Fi debugging is even better. So with the introduction of Android 11, you can start using Wi-Fi and connect your device and computer on the same network, and then you can debug over Wi-Fi. Now it's not super user-friendly at this point, as in order to use it, you need to be at least on Android 4.0 plus, which is the Canary build right now. And you also have to go into developer options to turn on this feature specifically. So here's a screenshot of like how you would turn it on. You are using Android 11, and then you just pair your device, search on your machine, and you would be able to start debugging wirelessly. Additionally, there were changes to the APIs themselves, specifically the annotations for recently nullable and recently non-null were added. What this would do is if you're a Kotlin developer, they would generate warnings when you're compiling your code if you are trying to access something that should not be nullable or was marked recently nullable. So you should probably fix those if you have time, because in the future, they would be marked with the annotations that are below, which is nullable and non-nullable. So as a Kotlin developer in this case, when you send a nullable type to something that is marked non-nullable, this will generate a compile time error and your project will essentially break. So this is, as a developer, if you're gonna target Android 11, this is something to watch out for, because there have been a lot of API changes that would mark certain stuff that was a warning before is now an error. And next slide. There were also enhancements to crash reporting. So as part of the 11 release, there is now API that lets you figure out essentially why your app crashed. And a lot of the times, this is an important use case where you're deploying onto a user's device that you have no idea about how your app is going to behave. And users are just complaining, hey, your application is crashing, so address this, but you are unable to reproduce that. So with the new crash reporting API, you can upload reports so you can investigate it better and query it as part of your development cycle as you ship stuff. If you get next slide. So we're going to see a quick example of how to use it. So essentially, you'll use the activity manager and query the reasons for why the application exited. And then it'll give you a list of possible reasons, whether it was low memory, ANR, or whatever for that reason. One of the things to notice is that as a developer, a lot of the times we use SDKs that would handle crash reporting for us. And typically, this API would be consumed by the SDK itself rather than as a developer for having to implement it yourself. But the option is there if you wanted to implement that for yourself. All right, GWP ASAN, what is that? So this is around, this applies mostly to the native developers. Previously, they had something called HWASAN, which was the Android, available on Android 10. And essentially, it is a memory allocator tool for native developers. And what it helps prevent is accessing a corrupt memory, and it lets you debug those issues. As you go to GWASAN, one of the major issues it it addresses is that you no longer have to install an additional memory allocator just to trace these memory related bugs and issues. It is also you can think of it as like a subset of this, so you can actually ship this into prod, and when this runs on a user's device and causes memory related issues, those reports can now be uploaded to Play Store, and you can trace what kind of issues are causing these crashes. So if you go to the next slide, you can see an example. So in order to use it, all you do is set the GWP ASAN flag to always. You can set it on the application level or even the activity level if you want, if you're interested in just a single activity and you don't really care about that application crash. And it will output traces like these where it'll tell you that you try to access something that you weren't supposed to, or trying to access corrupt memory, and give you traces that you can backtrack them. All right, next up is Adb Incremental. So it's a similar concept if you are familiar with apply changes, around the same thing, but this is also targeted towards some native development. And if you think in terms of games, those could be pretty massive APK sizes that you would have to deal with. So if you have something that is around 2 gigs and you're developing against it, you don't want to recompile that every time and deploy it onto the device, so if you're using native code. So with Adb Incremental, that speeds it up to 10 times, and there's some metrics on the right that'll show you what the difference is. So how do you use it? So using it is pretty simple. If you're an Android developer and you do command line installs, all you have to do is pass in -- incremental flag, and it would be readily available. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Jimmy.
Cool. Thanks, Naveed. So we're at the halfway point now, but there's still a lot to go through. I'm going to cover graphics and media next. So first off is useful for if you're an NDK developer, the native development kit. If you've ever needed to decode images previously, like decoding standard things like JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, you had to do some other workarounds, but now there is actually native support to decode those. Previously, you probably had to do stuff like go through JNI to go up to the Android SDK to run a decoder, and then go back down to the native level, or you had to package in another third-party decoding library, which would also make your APK size bigger. But now you don't have to do any of that. It's pretty straightforward and simple. You just create a code decoder. You set the target format like bitmap or JPEG. Create a buffer for the decoded image, and then you just decode it, and you'll have your image at the native level. You can also check out examples of this at the GitHub repo at android/ndk-samples. Next up is support for animated HEIF files, high efficiency image files. So if you have any of these files, then you can load them into your Android project, and they'll get loaded as animated image drawables. If you don't know what these are, they are just like animated GIF files, but just smaller and much more efficient. So you should try those out. And here's an example of what it looks like. You just get a reference to the file, create a source from it, and then off of the main thread, because this part is very resource intensive, you decode it and then check to see if it's an animated file. And if it is, you can just call .start on it to start the animation. Pretty straightforward. Next up is for native audio developers. So previously, if you wanted to process audio, you probably would have used something like OpenSLES, but that's now deprecated and not recommended. Another project called Oboe is now the recommended solution. So this is an unbundled C++ library. It's for high performance audio. It works all the way back until API level 16, and it's open source. You can find that repository there at on GitHub at google/oboe. So be sure to check that out if you deal with native audio processing. And you can also find out more about it on the Android Developers Backstage podcast, episode 135, audio podcast. Next up is about variable refresh rates. So previously, a lot of phones rendered onto the screen at 60 hertz, 60 frames a second. And within the last few years, a lot more phones have had much higher FPS than before, all the way up until 120 hertz even. And you now have a lot more control over it in Android 11, which is more useful if you have control over the rendering loop. If you're just developing apps with the standard SDK, then this might not apply to you. But if you are in control of your own rendering loop, such as making your own games, then you'll have a lot more control. So as I said, 60 frames per second used to be the norm. Now we have phones that are 90 hertz, 120 hertz. And that also gives you a lot more time to make more fluid animations. If you have a lot of things going on in your update loop, then you have more flexibility on how often the back off rates should be. And there's also an API you can call surface.setFrameRates to hint to the system that it should probably render during the next frame. Next up is there's a new thermal API in the NDK. This will give you more information about the system and the heat levels, and so you can respond to it accordingly. And there's no need to go jump through NDI up to the Android SDK just to get this information anymore. And this is also pretty straightforward. You just create a thermal listener. You can listen on events like shutdown, emergency, critical, register the listener, and react to it accordingly. And since we're dealing with native here, don't forget to unregister and release it when you're done. Another feature in Android 11 is the preview for Angle. For a lot of games, so Angle is a graphics engine that uses something called Vulkan instead of the native one. And it's supposed to be a little bit more higher performance than that, but it's still experimental. But if you go into your preferences, for non-core apps, you can change which graphics engine it uses. And this should help the apps determine whether it should be using Angle or should be using the native one. So that's something that you can try out in the Android 11 preview. And there's still a lot more to go over, not including the NDK stuff. So for the neural network API, version 1.3 is now released, and there's a lot more features in that, including a lot of new operations. There's operations including conditionals, loops. There's algorithms for training a little bit more efficiently with hard swish, if you're familiar with that. A new quantization schemes, as well as more control over how you execute your machine learning models on the device, including fencing the compute, more control over the memory domain for both the inputs and the outputs, as well as controlling the quality of service for when executing your machine learning model. Next up, 5G. So 5G is going to be here very soon, and a couple of phones already support it. And Android 11 gives you a couple of APIs to give you a better experience in that. Let's say you have a lot of files to download and you only want your users to download it on a Wi-Fi previously. Well, if they're on 5G, that might not be a restriction that you need to do anymore. So in Android 11, you can check to see if they're on a metered network and also get an estimate on how their bandwidth is. And here's an example of the code there. The main thing that you should take note here is that after getting the manager from the connectivity manager, is to check if it has the capability for not metered, to see if it's on 5G or Wi-Fi. And you can also check to see if it's on a fast network. And then accordingly, do your logic depending on what network they're on. Next up is Biometric Authenticator strength. So now you can also see how strong your biometric authenticator is. An example here is once we get the biometric managers, let's say you're on a really important app that you need to have a strong authentication mechanism, like you need to make sure that they're using fingerprints or another biometric authentication. You can set that to strong to make sure that they have that registered, or you can set that to weak if you don't need such a high level of security. Based on that, you can check to see if their authentication mechanism is strong enough. If it's not, you can tell them to do something like enroll in biometric security and send them to the settings to do that. Otherwise, then you can tell that they have authenticated strongly, if that makes sense. Next up is autofill and keyboard integration. So previously, you might have had to do something like have a separate dropdown in the UI just to have some autocomplete. Now you have support for that in the keyboard itself, as well as if you're making password apps, there's integration with that as well, and you can hook into that. Now, there might be, you might have some concerns with security, but you don't have to be, because the information that your keyboard gets back is only the UI to represent the data, but you don't actually get the data itself. So you don't have to worry about the security from that perspective. And here's some examples of that. In this case, we have a login screen where you can put in your username or email address. And if you see right above the keyboard, there is a autofill suggestion for the email address. Oops. We also have one, they also have one for your credit card number to fill out that information, as well as your address. So then you don't have to type that in all the time, and you don't have to build a separate UI just for that. And the way to hook into that is for the keyboards, you just have to implement a couple of input methods, service methods, specifically 2 of them, one for the request and one for the response. The request from when the keyboard is asking for suggestions, and the response for if it should be showing suggestions or not. And then if you're building a password app, you can also handle the onfill request method. And from there, you just create a data set, create an inline presentation, and you just build the response, and you should be good to go. Next up is a lot of non-platform updates. First up is Jetpack. If you're not familiar with Jetpack, that consists of a ton of libraries, over 70 libraries that Google gives you to use. A lot of them are released every 2 weeks. And there's a lot of things, including architectural things, compatibility libraries, app startup libraries, core functionality, just a ton of functionalities that you should take a look at and use. Some of the more recent and notable ones, I'm going to list out some of them here. One of it is Hilt. Previously, you might have used something like Jagger for DI in your apps. So now the officially recommended DI solution in Android is Hilt. Well, for Jetpack is Hilt, and that's built on Jagger, but it is a more complete solution for your DI needs in your Android app. Another one is Paging. So Paging 3.0 was released. It was completely redesigned using Kotlin and with Kotlin in mind. It had support for things like coroutines inside of it, so you can use the paging functionality a lot more easier with Kotlin, and it's also backwards compatible with Paging 2.0. And also the Camera X beta library is now out. So if you have an app that does filters or or anything to do with the camera functionality, check that one out. It's a lot easier to use than previous camera libraries. And a ton more that I can't go over now because there's a lot of material here. Actually, if you want to find out more about this, there is a video as well as an article. You can search for what's new in Jetpack, and that will explain a lot more. Next up is Jetpack Compose. So this one's a newer UI toolkit for Android. I believe it was announced last year, and now we are in developer preview 2. And what it is a library, a UI library it's reactive, it's based on Kotlin, and it's developed in the open. So as they're releasing new releases, if you find any issues, you can open up an issue and help shape how it's going. So definitely check that out. Next up is Android Studio. So there's a lot of releases of Android Studio currently going on. The first one is 4.0. That's currently stable. Some of the new features there includes the motion editor, which helps you create rich animations inside your app. Previously, you were able to create motion layouts, but throughout code, only using code, which could get tedious. Now there's an actual editor to help you edit those animations as well as see how they look like. Another one is the layout inspector. So if you ever wanted to see how your UI is layered inside of a 3D graph, then this will help you inspect that, and as well as some of the properties of your own UI. Android Studio 4.1 beta is also released. In there, they include the database inspector. So if your app is using something like Room or SQLite, then you can use the database inspectors to see what's inside your database. And you can also see it update live when you are testing out your app. But you can also edit the data inside of the database and see the updates reflected live in your app as well. So super helpful if your app includes database functionality. And version 4.2 Canary, there includes the wireless debugging functionality that Naveed was talking about earlier, as well as the Jetpack Compose library. So you're going to have to get this version of Android Studio if you want to test that out. Google Play also has a lot of updates. Some of the more notable ones, it's completely redesigned. It looks a lot better. It's supposed to be easier to use. It's clear. There's a new policy status section, and there's dashboards for user acquisition. There's reports for that, and more abilities for you to manage your team and who can access which dashboards. That's currently in beta, and if you want to check that out, go to play.google.com/console. So I know we went through a lot of information already, and this was just a short 1-hour meetup, but Google is pushing a lot of content out for Android 11. As Jared mentioned earlier, we're going to have 2 more series in this, going through more of the content. This is just the higher level stuff. But if you want to find out more about this, there's a lot of videos out there. So I'm just going to give you a couple of links here, including the videos. There's a series on YouTube. And we're currently in week 4 of what they're calling 11 weeks of Android. So every week they will be focusing on a new part of Android 11. So you can check out more information at this link on screen right now, d.android.com/11 weeks of Android. There's a lot of meetups happening throughout the world, including the one you're in right now. As well as a couple of articles, videos, podcasts, all on the link you see up above. You can either take a screenshot now or you can find the slides online later. And that's what we have for you today. Thank you, guys.
Real quick, I just posted the link to where the slides are. It's actually in a tweet that I sent out, but it's made it public so you can all view it at your leisure. So anyway, so I think that's about it. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Naveed. That was fascinating stuff. Highly recommend everyone on the list take a look at our devcommunity.org website. Please let us know if you have any suggestions or questions. Until next time, ciao.